So let's get back to the bell curve and where they went so badly wrong. Stephen Jay Gould pointed out that Stephen Jay Gould, by the way, was a top flight evolutionary biologist at Harvard. He died, I think, about 10 odd years ago. He wrote quite a lot of essays for Natural History magazine on mostly evolutionary topics that are still worth reading. Some of them are a little long in the tooth, but he's a good writer. And this coming Tuesday, we're going to read one of his essays called Carrie Buck's Daughter. Don't forget, this coming Tuesday, I want to get back into discussing some readings, and those are posted on the course website. Right. Gould pointed out that for that argument to work, first of all, intelligence has to be measurable by a single number, right? You can measure height and weight. You can measure length of the helmet horn on a water fleet, things like that. You have to measure intelligence in the same way. Intelligence has to rank people in linear order. There has to be a way where you can line people up along a continuum from smartest to dumbest. Intelligence has to be genetic, and intelligence has to be effectively unchangeable. You can first argue, and this is the kind of thing that the psychologists are still debating, that I've seen this in my own family, and you possibly in yours, that intelligence consists of so many types and sub-skills that it is an open question whether any single measurement can capture more than a small amount of it. You can have people who are brilliant at art or music who just happen not to be, really good at math. You can have people like my son and my sister who are brilliant, but struggle with things like ADHD that mean they don't do as well in school as they otherwise might. As long as my kid has teachers who can overlook the fact that he's easily distracted and has a tendency to blurt out random words, that he has a tendency to yell "banana" in the middle of class, as long as they can overlook that and work with it, he does fine. But certainly if he had the teachers I had when I was growing up, he would have done terribly. So my point there is just that intelligence is so hard to really define what it is. There was a guy named Arthur Jensen who tried to come up with something called the G factor that would basically correlate with all intelligence tests. The problem is there's some statistical difficulties with that, and Gould and Jensen actually got into a big argument about it. Now, heritability of IQ, it does have if you assume that IQ is the way we're going to measure intelligence. It's funny, at first, the French guy Binet, who invented the IQ test, wasn't trying to come up with an intelligence test. He was coming up with a test to identify pupils that needed extra help. And he didn't want it to become the kind of number that you get branded with that determines whether or not you go to college or are only fit to swab the toilets out. But that's the way it became. That's what it turned into all too often. Oh, one anecdote before I go on. Binet, the guy who invented the progenitor of the IQ test, inspired a program to test intelligence of recruits into the US Army in World War I. And what were called Army Alpha and Army Beta tests are pretty much the ancestors of all of the standardized testing you've ever taken. From the SAT down to the testing that I'm sure you got back in second grade or whatever. Okay, the benchmarks and all that. And I mean, I used to have to take a lot of generalized testing that weren't on subject knowledge, but they were things like, you know, here's a triangle, a square, a pentagon, what shape comes next? A circle, B, a hexagon, C, your mom's face, you know, whatever it might be. Tests like that where they give you these silly tasks with like sentence completion or find the next shape or figure out what piece fits here. All of that general stuff, that's all descended from Army testing when the US entered the First World War. And the problem with a lot of that testing, and it's not one that's gone away, is that so much of the questions that are asked are culturally based. One of the questions on the original intelligence test was cribbage is played with. A, dice. B, cards. C, balls. D, sticks. Anybody know? Yeah, well, most of you are clearly stupid. It's a card game. Yeah, you got it right, but if you didn't grow up playing cribbage, then you know that's not the sort of thing you'd be likely to know. One thing here, I'll go to the whiteboard just one last time. Let me see. You share whiteboard, share. Let's erase all of this stuff. One of the questions on the Army beta test was, here's a house. All right, there's a door. And there's a fireplace. And your task is to, this was a test for people who never learned to read. We had much more illiteracy at the time. And as a measure of your intelligence, you have to add something to the house to make it complete. Now, what would you draw on this diagram to make it complete?
Window.
Oh man, you're all dumb. What's that? Yeah, you all failed. Okay, the right answer, and the only one that got credit, is you have to draw the chimney.
Oh, okay.
All right. But a lot of people failed. There were stories about immigrants who came from Sicily in South Italy. That's a warm enough climate that they didn't have chimneys in their house. So they didn't draw in the chimney. But coming from that region of Italy, what they drew was the crucifix that if you were a good Sicilian, at least at the time, you were always supposed to have by your door. So they gave the right answer in the culture that they came from, but they got marked wrong on the intelligence test. And this was kind of this led to this moral panic because so many people got such low scores that, you know, it was fear that we were going to fill the army, you know, the bulk of our military strength with a whole bunch of morons who were fit to do absolutely nothing. And I'm not saying that everybody who got drafted into the Army was a freaking genius, but a lot of the questions were asked with a very obvious cultural bias that pretty much predestined certain people to end up with low scores. This is part of why a lot of famous universities are pulling back from things like the SAT. Because we don't all come from the same culture, and we're, you know, it's not really fair to ask people about questions, you know, coming from a culture that they're not a part of. Yeah, well, we have gotten a little bit better at test design, but it's been a problem that's been baked into standardized testing ever since the days of Army Alpha test.
I'd say that they did that on purpose.
What's that?
That they purposely made the test really.
Well, that's just it. I mean, the guy who made it was an upper class white dude and probably just simply assumed that the sorts of things that upper class white dudes in 1917 know are the sorts of things that you must know if you are to be considered intelligent. I don't think they're quite as blatant about it now, but still, it's really hard to design questions like that that don't have any possible cultural bias slant to them. And again, that's a little bit out of my field. But even if we assume that IQ is what we're going to use to measure intelligence, we know that the heritability of IQ is pretty high. In adults, the heritability of IQ tends to be over 0.85. Okay, so Murray and Herrnstein argue that IQ is in fact genetically controlled, that your genes have a lot more to do with your intelligence than environment that you're in. So if people are stupid, it's because they got stupid genes. The problem is that just because a trait has high heritability says absolutely nothing about environmental effects on it. Remember that slide I showed you of the Galapagos finch data, where before a drought, you had this graph of mid-parental and mid-offspring genotype with a slope of about 0.8. And then after the drought, the line had shifted in that direction. There had been an environmental change, but the slope was still the same. Let's say we grow plants in two different environments. On the left here, we've got corn, good old Zea mays, growing in a very good environment, rich soil with tons of fertilizer and lots of water. And on the right, we've got corn growing in a drought-stressed environment, and it's a lot shorter and looks a lot less healthy. Within each environment, plant height probably shows high heritability. So in the field on the right, tall corn plants will tend to have tall offspring, and small corn plants will tend to have small offspring. And the same is true for both. The corn in each field might show high heritability. And yet, even though heritability is high, that doesn't mean environment does nothing. In fact, it does a lot. We can take seed from the stressed population and grow it in good conditions, and that height difference is probably going to disappear. Right? So just because a trait has high heritability does not mean that it is not also strongly affected by the environment. And that's part of why I've been hammering that heritability is meaningless without a reference to the population that it's in. Now, instead of corn height, substitute intelligence. You might find very high heritability of intelligence among a population of very upper class people who buy their kids lots of educational toys and send them to Montessori school and then private schools and force them to learn Mandarin at the age of 6 and take them to Europe every year and get them into Harvard. In that population, you might have very high heritability of intelligence. Now take a population of, I don't know, poor rednecks working at the Dollar General store in Guy, Arkansas, who don't have those opportunities and don't have the money, and whose kids probably grow up a little bit more dumb than the kids from Little Rock Heights who are getting all of those, Montessori toys and all that. If you measured the heritability of IQ in Little Rock Heights, you'd get high heritability. If you measured the IQ of kids in Guy Perkins, you'd get high heritability. But that does not mean that people who live in Guy Perkins are intrinsically, genetically stupider than people that live in the Heights. Because if you gave those kids in Guy Perkins the opportunities that people in the Heights have, you might well completely erase that difference. Put it like this. Let me go back to the whiteboard for one more time. Let's erase all of that. And let's say we're doing another one of those graphs where we are graphing mean parental versus mean offspring IQ. people living in this very enriched environment, and less intelligent people have less intelligent offspring, and we get a bunch of spots that look like this. Okay, some of these are not really circles, but I'm doing the best I can here. And then we take a bunch of completely ignorant hillbillies from Guy, or I don't know, what's that? Pine Bluff or Harrison or something like that. And we might get something like this. Right? And in both populations, right, we get a line with a very high slope. Yes. So within each population, IQ's heritability is high. That does not mean that intelligence is genetically determined, because if you gave Little Rock Heights style conditions to the people in Harrison or Marshall or Pine Bluff or, okay, Perryville, what's that? Bald Knob or Bigelow, you could take that green line right there and just push it right to where the red line is. So high heritability does not mean genetically determined. It's not there. The two concepts are emphatically not the same thing. And that's the big thing that Murray and Herrnstein missed. The way to figure this out is to do a common garden experiment. You take seed from the corn on the left and plant it in the field on the right, and vice versa. To prove the bell curves argument, we would have to do that. And the problem is that's not really ethical. We would have to take, remember, they're arguing about race. So we'd have to take a bunch of black kids from the hood and adopt them out by a bunch of wealthy white yuppies. And we'd have to take a bunch of wealthy white yuppie kids and adopt them to families in the hood. And there's no really ethical way that we can do that. That would violate an awful lot of ethical concerns. But nobody's really done that. And the authors of the bell curve just write that environmental differences of this magnitude and pattern are implausible. They just simply waved it away, didn't believe that differences in the environments that white and black kids are raised in, they didn't believe those were different enough to affect their conclusions. But they didn't offer any data about that. They didn't test it at all. And that's where their argument falls short. They're confusing heritability with genetic determinism. Their argument is basically that because the heritability of IQ is high, that means that your intelligence is entirely determined by genes. And that intelligence is not only determined by genes, it's determined by genes along racial boundaries. That just as African Americans tend to have darker skin on average, they also tend to be stupider. Of course, they don't use such harsh words, but we all know what they're talking about. Where that fails is, well, it fails on more counts than I'm even getting into. What I will get into here before I end my rant for the day is that just because a trait has high heritability simply does not mean that it's genetically programmed. Just because IQ is high does not mean that you can't increase or decrease it by the choice of the environment that the kid grows up in. Part of Murray and Herrnstein's argument is that because IQ is genetically programmed, government programs that are supposed to decrease the achievement gap between blacks and whites, like Head Start and things like that, are simply a waste of money and should be cut so that we can afford to pay for, tax cuts for the rich. So yeah, it's not just a racial rant, it's a commentary on the kinds of social programs that they'd like to be sliced. And I don't want to tell you guys how to vote or how the politics works, but the evidence that they present simply does not support that conclusion. Just because a trait has high heritability does not mean the environment can't affect it. And it certainly doesn't mean that carefully chosen social programs cannot have a positive effect on it. I mean, for that matter, for the time and place where, remember that graph I showed you way back when that looked at IQ of Black and white populations in that national longitudinal survey of youth? And there was a pretty big difference. That could be because of educational inequalities, because schools in Black neighborhoods tend to get underfunded for various reasons. For that matter, it could also have been lead paint. You know, lead paint tended to get used in African-American neighborhoods, and what's that?
Asbestos.
Could be asbestos, but asbestos isn't going to decrease your IQ, whereas lead exposure does if you get it in childhood. So there's a lot of reasons why that data could have been observed that have nothing whatsoever to do with your genes, and certainly don't make any kind of grounds for a recommendation that we shouldn't do anything about racial inequality because we're stuck with it. And by the way, if this sounds awfully woke, Murray Herrnstein published a follow-up book in which they repeated the same arguments, but basically made them instead for the working poor, i.e. most of Arkansas. They argued that the reason why everybody who didn't live in New York, New England, or California is a dribbling moron is because of the same thing. That, you know, lower class white folks in states like this one are genetically inferior to their betters at Harvard. They're not just focusing on race, they are focusing very much on class as well. And Arkansas being not a very glamorous state, not one with a great record of doing much of anything other than producing rice and chicken and Walmart. And what's that?
Rice.
And grass.
Rice.
Sorry?
Rice.
Rice. Yeah, I thought I said rice.
Oh, I thought you said grass.
Okay, I meant rice. You know, we grow a crazy amount of it, of course.
Yeah.
But the same people that are taking aim at programs meant to help African Americans would also like to take aim at programs aimed at people in flyover country, which is basically all of us, regardless of race. A lot of the arguments that they use in one direction can be turned on other groups. It's not just all about being justice for the African American community. It's ultimately justice for everybody that's at stake. For everybody who isn't a Harvard graduate running an investment banking firm. Okay, right. I am feeling my rant subside. It is 12:12. I'm gonna upload these and then get out of here.